following program contains scenes of sexuality, violence, coarse language, and adult themes. Because it's awesome! Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Lady Bits Episode 5. I'm Leanna Kirsner. There's a cat wrestling match going on behind the couch. Momo has recovered from his illness, and this is my Player 2 Glowy Box. The question for this episode is, how important is a female playable character? For that matter, how important is any playable character when it comes to the tone, presentation, and themes of a game? Are other types of characters sometimes more important? Well, the short answer is, it depends on the game. In games with playable characters, not all of them have them, but when they do, there are two main types: first-person playable characters and third-person playable characters. A third-person character is a character like Lara Croft, Senua from Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. You can see them on the screen. The story tends to revolve around their character and actions, and they're often avatars of playstyles with strong personalities and lots of opinions. These women are integral to the themes and tone of their games. A first-person character, such as Chell in Portal, Faith in Mirror's Edge, is more like a camera view with arms and sometimes legs. They often say nothing or next to nothing, and they're less developed as characters because they're essentially the virtual suit a player wears to interact with the game world. In first-person shooters, action, adventure, and horror games, there's often a scene-stealing antagonist to boost the drama.
Time out for a second. That wasn't supposed to happen.
In other games, sidekick characters are used to boost the human element. If a developer is conscious of the strengths and limits of the two perspectives, they can defy the norms associated with them. The highly underrated 2K Games horror shooter The Darkness uses a first-person perspective with a defined main character, simulating the impact of Jackie Estacado being consumed by the darkness during combat, but regaining himself and a third-person perspective in quieter moments. Meanwhile, in the third-person Batman Arkham Asylum, Mark Hamill's voice portrayal of the Joker stole the show and became the game's dominant character. But come on, he's Mark Hamill. Attempting to go against the grain can backfire. After the first two BioShock games had mostly silent protagonists, BioShock Infinite decided to make the playable character, Booker DeWitt, more chatty. The game waffles between letting the player make cosmetic moral choices, like whether to throw a baseball at an interracial couple, whether to choose the bird or the cage for Elizabeth Baroche, but then the game potentially undermines the meaning of those choices for the player through Booker's dialogue.
Give a man a little power, he falls in all kinds of love with himself.
Booker's dialogue makes it clear that he doesn't care about any of it. Having the character decide that a racist theocracy is morally equal to the rebels opposing that theocracy is taking away a big interactive choice element from a player and needs to be done with care in any game. But characters with strong opinions like this get especially messy in first-person perspective because if the player isn't on the same page, it's like having voices in your head that are constantly disagreeing with you. It's like induced insanity.
Did I ever tell you what the definition of insanity is? Insanity.
Speaking of insanity, Far Cry 3 and 4 use first-person view more deliberately. The identity of the playable character and that character's motivations are actually very important to choosing the most satisfying ending. But the games do their best to make the player forget who that character is, as they're immersed in an orgy of blood, drugs, and adrenaline. Far Cry games tempt the player to lose themselves in the savagery while offering outcomes that reward them for remembering who their fictional self was at the start of the game. the first-person perspective aids in the challenge to retain your in-game sense of self. It might not be a surprise that in these games, the most dominant character is the primary antagonist. Vas Montenegro and Pagan Min are charismatic, bombastic, colorful characters that get the coveted box art spot instead of the playable character. This trend continues in the upcoming Far Cry 5.
Awesome.
In survival horror games, player perspective appears to labor under a generation gap. Gen Xers like me don't have a problem being drawn into a survival horror game with a third-person perspective. Resident Evil, complete with optional female playable character, way back in 1996 was the Night of the Living Dead of our generation. Seriously, I'm fairly sure a couple of hunters in that game made me pee myself a few times. To this day, I hate those things. Like I hate The Sims. I hate The Sims. But according to the developers of modern horror games like The Evil Within, millennials tend to only find horror games scary when they're first-person games like Amnesia and Outlast. They don't understand why they should be scared about something happening to another person, which backs up my theory that first-person characters are essentially skins to the player, but it also makes me worry about a profound empathy deficit in some millennials. This is all kind of philosophical, meaning confusing and right on the line of overthinking the issue. So let's show you different types of playable characters in action in a very special versus mode.
What are you doing, cat person? How is it that you don't talk and I do? Oh, you're one of those silent, first-person playable characters, aren't you? The ones that get praised for being inclusive because you have no discernible character points that someone could complain about. You're really irrelevant to the proceedings here, though I admit that I'm enjoying being able to talk to you like this without being interrupted. Can we make this a more regular thing? This will probably be a popular segment, you realize, because I'm a cat. You better give me lap time now, or there will be consequences.
Wow, it's really hard to have a conversation in first-person mode. It made me feel like Garfield talking in thought balloons.
Is that a species' joke about me being a cat?
No, it was just a reference.
It was a human microaggression.
Since when do you care about microaggressions?
Since I can use the concept against you, I am a cat.
Psychic cat, apparently. Anyway, we were talking about the importance of female playable characters in video games.
Are they cats?
Usually not.
Then they're not important.
Well, Felicia in Darkstalkers is kind of a cat.
Let's talk about her then.
And Bayonetta can turn into a panther?
Also acceptable. Who else?
The Stalker and Ravager machines in Horizon Zero Dawn look like cats?
Questionable, but I'll allow it. Go on.
Cat Monroe from Star Fox? Cat Sith in Final Fantasy VII? King in Tekken? Alvina and Sweet Shalcor from Dark Souls?
That's a good one.
Burger Pants in Undertale!
Far less good one.
There are cats in Assassin's Creed games and Grand Theft Auto 5.
Mine are characters. They don't even have names.
Shema and Shameen in Quest for Glory?
Good recovery.
Mao from Shadow Hearts from the New World? The Cookie in King's Quest?
That's objectifying.
The Saber-toothed Tigers and Cave Lions from Far Cry Primal? Meowth from Pokemon?
I'm going to pee on your shoes for that one.
You don't like Meowth?
I hate Meowth. Like you hate The Sims.
I hate The Sims.
What else you got, cat person? That's it?
I think there are more, but I'm forgetting.
It seems like there's a bigger problem regarding feline representation in gaming than female representation. Gaming is full of dogs. Dogs in Fable. Dogs in Fallout. Dogs span gaming from Duck Hunt to Grand Theft Auto 5. Factor in the wolves and werewolves, foxes, coyotes, jackals, doles, gnolls, and so on. And cats are heavily underrepresented compared to canines.
I'm cute and I love you. This was not what this segment was supposed to be about.
Well, you shouldn't have been the playable character then. The playable character reacts to things, follows quests given by other characters, retrieves things for other characters, slays monsters on the orders of other characters. Playable characters rarely dictate what happens in a game, because the more decisions they make, the fewer decisions the player can make.
Huh. You have a point.
Of course I do. Now you properly respect your feline overlords, so give me more attention. No.
The reactive quality of playable characters that Mephisto pointed out is what makes designing female playable characters a unique challenge. The fact that most game developers are male means that they don't have the same grasp of how the world reacts to women differently. One of my favorite comical non-distinctions on this point happens in the Saints Row games. Whether you play as a man or a woman, the leader of the Saints is surrounded by female strippers, essentially making female playable characters hardwired non-heterosexual. Saints Row games are also the only games I've played that allow a player to select a voice that doesn't necessarily match the anatomy of the character. You can have your female character sound like Nolan North if you want. All of the clothes are also available to be worn for all types of characters, so you can put a male character in a dress. And you can change your gender at any time you want by visiting a cosmetic surgeon, providing players with the option to play the game as a gender fluid or trans person, not through the plot, but through the gameplay. Saints Row developer Volition is way ahead of other North American developers in this regard, since most Western developers don't know how to create an action heroine who isn't just a man with breasts or the dreaded overly perfect Mary Sue, never mind moving beyond the gender binary. Japanese developers don't seem to struggle in the same way. In Japan, there are female playable characters all over the place in anime-style RPGs, fighting games, and in games like Gravity Rush, Bayonetta, Nier Automata, ReCore, and even games like the much-maligned Super Princess Peach. This isn't an accident. Japanese audiences have flocked to female-driven entertainment for decades, including Western films like Titanic and Frozen. But the big name in Japanese film is Studio Ghibli and its visionary director, Hayao Miyazaki. Miyazaki's wildly popular animated films like Princess Mononoke, Howl's Moving Castle, and Spirited Away likely deserve a lot of the credit for the Japanese video game embrace of women. Western media just doesn't have a Miyazaki-san. Miyazaki is often compared to Walt Disney, but Disney tended to adapt fairy tales, which means princesses, fairies, fairy princesses, more princesses, commoners' daughters who become princesses. Some of the furries are even basically princesses. Nala from The Lion King is even part of an arranged marriage. So many of the female characters in Western gaming are forced to be gender flips of male archetypes. Lara Croft is a female Indiana Jones. April Ryan from The Longest Journey is a female Frodo Baggins. You could even claim that Joanna Dark from the Perfect Dark games, whose name is an approximation of Joan of Arc, is a gender flip of James Bond in Rare's previous N64 shooter GoldenEye. Even Mortal Kombat's Sonya Blade was given a backstory originally intended for Jax or Stryker, depending on who you ask. The first female fighter in the Mortal Kombat series was a late addition because the team decided they needed a girl fighter. So, the importance of female playable characters, especially in Western games, lies in creating a more diverse catalog of female archetypes that gamers immediately understand. Every female playable character makes it easier to create more female playable characters. Games with large character rosters seem to include women better, possibly because game publishers aren't worried guys will feel stuck playing a female character. So, hero-driven multiplayer games like Overwatch and League of Legends have lots of quality female characters that men enjoy playing as well as women. Female playable characters also seem to be more common early in console cycles, perhaps because publishers have lower sales expectations. But these characters suffer from a smaller potential consumer base as well. The Assassin's Creed franchise only put standalone playable female assassins in PlayStation Vita and downloadable side-scroller games. Jewel from ReCore suffered from both sluggish Xbox One sales and the fact that the game felt rushed out. Nariko and Kai from Heavenly Sword suffered from being an early PS3 title. At the time, the Xbox 360 had a huge sales advantage because it had been released a year earlier. But game critics at the time were also giant assholes to Heavenly Sword. Instead of judging a perfectly good, innovative game on its merits, they punished it because it defied what they thought games should be. And this gets to another reason why female characters and any character that challenges the developer to question design assumptions is important. Changing up the protagonist creates the potential for different types of stories. Different types of stories inform different types of gameplay, different goals, different victory conditions, different responses from the in-game world. And that means innovation. But to innovate, we have to challenge assumptions. When it comes to gender, we've been laboring under the same basic assumptions about gender for the bulk of the last 2,000 years. In this week's Lady Bit, we're going to dive into the concept of natural law. Okay, here we go. Natural law theory. It's difficult to summarize it quickly because it's weird. It's often defined as the theory that there's a universal human nature that is knowable by reason. It insists that this innate nature must dictate morality, and this morality can't change because it's given to us by God. Natural law theory is essential to our ideas of universal human rights. It isn't so universal, it's also been used to justify slavery and the denial of equal rights to people of color, women, gay people, and trans people. Under this belief system, women and non-white men are inherently less capable of reason and therefore less able to understand morality. Therefore, the ruling status of white men is natural and for the benefit of everyone. Natural law theory is often associated with Christianity because it was refined by Thomas Aquinas. But the core of the concept comes from ancient Greece, that land of highly patriarchal societies that produced many famous philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and Zack Snyder movies full of lots of slow motion. Aristotle believed that womanhood was a state of lacking maleness and that women were such incomplete beings that the natural way of things was male rule. Other cultures had their own sex role differentiations, but they didn't have the rigid patriarchal hierarchies that the Greek city-states and then the Roman Empire did. These hierarchies stunted these cultures in some ways, but they excelled at producing fantastic militaries. Aristotle's views were spread around the world through the armies of his student, Alexander the Great. Judaism is the only Abrahamic faith that predates Aristotle, and it's no accident that women with at least one Jewish parent were overrepresented in second-wave feminism. Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Shulamith Firestone, Gloria Allred, Robin Morgan, and even Andrea Dworkin all grew up in households with decidedly non-Aristotelian ideas of womanhood. Natural law also dictates that the justice system and scientific pursuits adhere to a moral system with Aristotle's profound bias against the women's. And so a great many things became seen as innate or natural instead of learned or socially enforced behaviors. Voting was considered too stressful for women. Working outside the home was thought to be against nature. Marital rape was considered impossible because of the idea that women never really consented to sex because women never really like sex. Birth control was considered an aberration because of the assumption that women only had sex to have babies, never for pleasure. This is all nonsense, but that's the point. Science was being forced to conform to religious philosophy instead of facts being the driving force behind ethical debates. After Charles Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, scientists started applying social Darwinism to prove existing gender and race roles. This was the origin of fields such as sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. Don't yell at me, I'm just citing history. Natural law is also at the core of psychological theories like Freud's penis envy and both Freud and Jung's obsession with the phallus. This psychological obsession with dick also influenced Jacques Lacan, who came up with gaze theory. So These fields and others are still trying to rid themselves of a lot of junk science, because it wasn't until the 1940s that natural law got an effective philosophical opponent: existentialism, which is a really confusing movement, so we're only going to focus on one part of it. Simone de Beauvoir applied existentialist thought to gender and articulated the sex-gender distinction, a concept in which sex refers to anatomy and physiology, and gender describes one's social role and identity. So, theoretically, someone could be anatomically female but assume the social role of a man, something that indigenous cultures around the world have recognized for hundreds of years. De Beauvoir theorized that behaviors recognized as feminine are trained, not innate, and this is the core of social constructionist theory, which was central to many of the demands of second-wave feminism. The women of the second wave suffered a lot to drag us out of church-driven, natural law-inspired thinking. That's why any claim that there might be some biological component to sex role differences is met with a strong negative reaction. But this knee-jerking becomes a problem when we're looking at video games, because researchers consistently find differences in how, for instance, the majority of men and the majority of women navigate space, an element that's obviously crucial to game design. Men are more likely to rely on compass directions and maps, while women are more likely to rely on landmarks. The problem, historically, is that the things that men tend to be better at are seen as inherently more valuable than the things that women tend to be better at. One place where scientists have consistently found that females hold an advantage is in observing, remembering, and describing emotions. Guess what Aristotle downplayed in his theories in favor of cognition and deliberation? Yep, the thing that women excel at. The thing is, science has also found that emotional responses happen faster than cognitive ones, which means an enhanced understanding of emotions is actually a very useful thing. Aristotle's own understanding of emotion was rudimentary, describing it in a binary of pleasure and pain that needed to be moderated by reason, which is very male of him. Women tend to use far more words to describe emotions, which any reader of romance novels can confirm. However, video games, a predominantly male activity, are a combination of highly focused tasks, something many men do better than many women, and emotional rewards, which women are better at understanding and crafting. This leads us to a truth which complicates analysis of gender in gaming. Gamers of both genders don't tend to be sex-typical, and they certainly aren't held up as gender ideals. Which is why I love you guys. Male gamers, not men who play games, but specifically men who identify as gamers, tend to display more artistic, imaginative tendencies and prefer the emotional experiences of video games to the grunt work of sports. Whether it's saving Princess Peach, stopping aliens from invading the planet, bringing prosperity back to a kingdom, or seeking revenge against a grievous wrong, the thing that elevates AAA video games above simple time wasters is the emotional connection to these interactive stories, which is not exactly seen as sex-typical for men, except for the fact that the emotions are shown in video games, not told, which means men can experience these emotions without finding words for them. Gaming also makes emotional experiences more acceptable by using gameplay to turn them into more masculinized, task-focused experiences, overriding the socially programmed fear that emotions are weakness. On the flip side, lifelong female gamers, like me, aren't sex-typical either. I love puzzles. I love games with a lot of difficulty. I like to stick with a game until it's finished, no matter how long it is, instead of jumping around between shorter experiences. Most gamers have also encountered that woman in a multiplayer setting who's more aggressive, foul-mouthed, and competitive than any of the guys. Again, that's awesome, but it's not sex-typical. Now, is the fact that I'm not sex-typical based in nurture, that I've played a lot of games and trained my brain to think this way, or is it nature? I'm just not cognitively wired like the majority of women. Well, it's probably a combination of both. Gamers tend to be men who are more sensitive and women who are more practical. In other words, we're nerds. No, seriously, hear me out. all nerds, or geeks if you want, male, female, and everything in between, have socially suffered for not conforming to gendered ideals. And for many male gamers, the only way they're able to access that coveted ideal masculinity is through video games. Nerds have learned to mimic an exaggerated, aggressive male gender performance, which has led to gaming's bad reputation as a toxic environment. Many female gamers, though, have adopted somewhat cartoonish female gender performances as well, complete with hair colors not found in nature and either a hypersexualized persona or a childlike one. Other gamers use games to perform gender subversively, playing as a gender that doesn't match their own so they can be rewarded for elements of their personality that aren't seen as normal. I do that all the time. In a violent video game, I'm not constantly criticized for being too loud, not nice enough, and too obsessed with details. My detail-oriented thinking is put to good use in games, solving puzzles and beating levels, where in real life, my desire to solve problems is interpreted as me being a bitch. Because I'm not interested in hearing people complain about the same life drama again. That's why natural law theory that sorts people into binaries of men and women, free and slave, rich and poor, black and white, and so on isn't natural at all. Many people don't fit neatly into one box or the other. This is important for the cultural critics of games to realize because they tend to love their identity politics. Despite their professed adherence to social constructionist theory, their behavior is made up of attempts to force normalization through loud insults. This is also important for game developers to realize because games aren't made for men in general or women in general. They're made for the specific men and women who will consider buying video games. And we don't tend to be gender typical. This creates a huge challenge for developers who have to appeal to gamers as a core consumer base, but also expand the appeal of games to appeal to the majority, people who think in more sex-typical ways. For a long time, the imperfect solution was the caricatured masculinity of dude bro culture, and that hypermasculine performance felt good for years. It gave male gamers a roadmap to a sense of belonging that they otherwise lacked. Unfortunately, that dude bro culture is what led to a near wipeout of female playable characters in Western video games. Female characters could only be included if men could play their games and not feel less manly. The hypersexualized female characters of past decades gave men a gender performance hall pass. The guys who enjoyed playing as female characters could tell themselves they were just looking at titties, which is much more acceptable male behavior. Oh, and ass, of course. Can't forget the bootay. Bootay, 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 bootay. Of course, this is profoundly heteronormative and gay gamers said as much, but you get what I mean. And this wasn't always the case in gaming. I could spend entire episodes just naming those characters, which is why I've dedicated future episodes to doing just that. For now, it's enough to identify the two main shifts towards games being for males instead of for everyone. The forced hybridization of game sales with the heavy gendering of toys in the mid-1980s, and the Xbox era of the first decade of the new millennium, which was the first wave of video game hardware that originated in America, not Japan. Those X-Bros that flooded into gaming during the Halo years are the dumbasses who don't want to play as girls. With the PS4 reclaiming dominance in the PC gaming market experiencing a renaissance, titles with female leads like Horizon Zero Dawn and Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice are exceeding expectations. This is especially impressive since both games are new intellectual properties, which sometimes struggle to find an audience. Of course, then there's Bayonetta, whose games are so informed by the fact that she's female that I keep forgetting the similarities to Devil May Cry. More often, however, a playable character's gender is purely cosmetic. The gender of the playable character in games like Dragon Age, Mass Effect, Fallout, and Skyrim don't impact the game player's story outside of romance options. So the question is less whether a character needs to be female and more whether a male or female character is the most interesting choice for a given game. I remember the original nickname that people gave the first Uncharted game. Dude Raider. The only thing that differentiated Uncharted from a Tomb Raider game was that the main character was a goofy guy instead of a steely woman. When I see pieces of myself in male characters, I realize that the things I have in common with men far outweigh the things that make me different. We're doing a disservice to male gamers to deny them a similar experience with women. So, are female playable characters important? Yeah, but how important? Well, maybe the answer is obvious. They're just as important or unimportant as any type of character because variations make games more interesting and therefore more fun. And you know what else is fun? Trophies! Trophy time, let's do this. All right, the inspiration for this week's trophy is that I've always found the old PlayStation 3 6-axis controllers kinda look like boobs. You'll never unsee that now. You're welcome. On to the shelf. And we are done, so Momo is back for the curtain call. Like what you see, donations are appreciated, and monthly backers on Patreon get a special backers-only episode. Next time, we're gonna look at a big topic. What's healthy sexuality and what's sexually objectifying? But for now, I'm Leanna Kersner, this is Momo, and thanks for letting us show you our kitty bits and our lady bits. I'm cute and I love you.
No.
Ow.